Welcome to Voices in Action, a new podcast by the Eastern Oregon Center for Independent Living about disability in Oregon. I'm your host, Leo Alenak. Over the course of this first season, we'll cover a variety of topics related to disability justice education, speak with leaders of local advocacy organizations, and learn from one another in the process. This week, in the second of a two-parter, we'll be talking about housing, specifically the Willamette Street proposal in Eugene. Housing is an ongoing struggle, particularly as capitalism, gentrification, and colonization continue to push marginalized people out onto the streets. I spoke with several individuals across Oregon about the housing crisis, and in this episode, we'll be diving into an interview with Zondi Zinke, an organizer in Eugene working with the Decriminalize Homelessness Alliance.
My name is Zondi Zinke, and I'm a community organizer in Eugene, Oregon. And for the particular project that I've been organizing around that I think we'll talk about on today's podcast, I've been working with an organization called Decriminalize Homelessness, or it's an alliance of different organizers called Decriminalize Homelessness Alliance.
So what's the Decriminalize Homelessness Alliance?
It's really organizers from different sort of organizing sectors within the city of Eugene who came together around sort of different issues on the spectrum of the ways in which homelessness gets criminalized and the situation worsened. And so actually the project that I think we'll talk about is in part to block resources going to something that we think will accelerate gentrification, and in that way is on the spectrum of things that affect houselessness. Yeah, it's a matter of individuals from different organizing groups coming together and organizing together.
Can you give some examples on what criminalizing homelessness means and what it looks like?
I mean, I think a basic one, there was a time a couple years ago where Eugene has an alternative to the municipal court called community court, which is a really touted sort of as an alternative that's less punitive, et cetera, that many houseless people get routed into community court. And it's supposed to be very benign and sort of take away, detract from the ways in which houseless people get criminalized. However, when I read the docket from one day in community court, there were something like 103 entries, cases that were going to be seen in one day. And all but 5 of them were either for criminal trespass 2 or open container. I hate the phrase criminal trespass 2 because it sounds like something, maybe, home invasion, someone's climbing through your window. It's not that at all. It's people with no place to go sitting down against a building, on the portion of sidewalk that's actually privately owned as opposed to publicly owned, then it qualifies as criminal trespass 2. It doesn't have anything to do with breaking into any buildings or anything like that. And open container means someone is drinking alcohol just like many people do who are housed, and they do it within their own homes, and it's not criminal. But if you don't have a home and you drink alcohol outside, then that's criminal. So those are just 2 examples of ways in which simply being houseless, having nowhere to do regular survival activities or very normalized activities such as drinking alcohol are crimes because you have nowhere to do them because you are houseless.
I know that the big project this organization is working on is the Willamette Street proposal. Could you speak on that a little bit?
Yeah. So basically, the city of Eugene is currently considering a proposal by a limited liability corporation. So a corporation that is, I think one big problem with it is that the corporation is looking for $10 million worth of city subsidies in order to build housing, and they're pitching it as affordable housing. And technically affordable housing, it depends on how you define it. So basically what we have here is there 51% of the units will be what are called income qualified units, meaning people who make over 80% of the area median income wouldn't be able to rent those units for a temporary period of time. The proposed time right now is 35 years. So we could think, oh, okay, $10 million in subsidy, and this is for affordable housing. And you know what? If we just stopped there, probably most people would support it. And I would maybe support it because I really want people to be able to move off of the streets and gain the stability that comes from shelter, when you have a roof over your head, a decent base off of which to function. However, we have to be very alert to what has become a PR scam of so-called affordable housing. So what the developers in this case have proposed are studios that will rent for just under $1,000 a month. So that's $980 a month for studios designed for one person. They're under 400 square feet. Mm-hmm. And this does not at all penetrate where the level of need is in the city of Eugene. Mm-hmm. The city itself identifies that there are units that rent between, I think it's $875 and up into the $1,200 range, that there's actually a surplus of 4,800 units renting in that category. Yet they identify 13,500 unit deficit for housing that would rent for $625 a month or less. And so that is basically where there's that 13,500 unit need, is for households that live off of $25,000 per year or less. Mm-hmm. So the 80% AMI, that's individuals making $39,200 a year. Mm-hmm. And the developers have even named young urban professionals, yuppies, as their anticipated renter pool for those income qualified units. And so, if we get into the details, which generally don't get covered by mainstream media, it just becomes a really quick sell to the public, where the public thinks, okay, our tax dollars are going towards helping people who really, need housing. But that's not what's happening at all in this case. The other parts is that, one, I want to say that in very short order, 25 organizations signed on to a letter that asks the city to reject the proposal and asks for other things. And before I get into what those other things are, I would just like to read some of the organizations: NAACP, Lane East Asian Network, Community Alliance of Lane County, Black Indigenous Women of Color Rising, Black Sex Worker Collective, Cooperation Eugene, 350 Eugene, Sunrise Eugene, Eugene DSA, Eugene Showing Up for Racial Justice, Human Rights, Human Stories, Eugene Springfield Solidarity Network, and definitely Lane Independence Living Alliance, and many others. And so I want to share those endorsements that came so readily to basically, when you hear what is being requested beyond just the rejection of the proposal, we understand that all these human and environmental rights and basic justice rights organizations are behind a different economic model. And so that can often be treated as a fringe idea, but it really isn't. So basically, the other demands are that the property be used to support the development of community land trust housing or otherwise community-owned housing, and that this housing have pro-BIPOC, pro-disabled, pro-houseless, pro-poor, etc. covenants. Because we understand, first of all, in terms of the economic modeling, if we are to give large public subsidies to basically high capitalist models for basic infrastructure, such as affordable housing, to be built, we will constantly be cornered in what is trickle-down economics. And even, President Biden, who's in no way fringe, has declared several times now in the last month that trickle-down economics is a proven failure. So what happens is these developers, they say the phrases won't pencil out if they don't get, in this case, $10 million of public subsidy. But what we know and see is that not penciling out which gets that position gets reviewed by an industry consultant. So it's sort of like if we consider the subprime mortgage crisis, there were industry consultants that said, "Oh, this mortgage bundling is fine, it's good," right? So it's the same sort of thing where the industry knows who its clients are. But what that is based on is not based on the cost of materials or the cost of labor. It's actually based on what the investors can demand as a return. So that is an ever increasing rate, because the more they can say, basically in this case, there's a 12% internal rate of return expected for investors. So that is, one, very high, and two, it just shows that there's no limit to how much profit can be made within that high capitalist model. And so what the people here are saying is, no, we don't want our essential infrastructure, such as housing, affordable housing, held hostage by an economic model where more and more money, more public resource gets funneled to the top. And so another demand of the letter is for community land trust housing, as I just said, and that basically would, one, allow for the rentals to be actually affordable in a category that has demonstrated need and isn't just sort of subsidizing yuppies, because that can apparently pass as affordable housing. And also there's the want for the city to establish anti-racist and anti-discriminatory policies. And an example of this is we can find, for example, in California, just in the past couple of years, they have passed a regulation that says any public utility land that is going to be either donated or sold, the right of first refusal must be offered to Indigenous peoples with ties to the land, whether those tribes are federally recognized or not. So in a case with another property in Eugene, which is about to be given away actually to the same developers, that was formerly public utility land. If we had that regulation here, then Indigenous people who we know have been displaced would have right of first refusal to that land. And so we're basically saying we cannot continue to marginalize BIPOC people and other people who have been targeted or exploited or marginalized. So then the last component is because a lot of this has to do with the economic modeling and where we put public resources. So if this proposal had come in and it weren't requesting $10 million, that's being asked for, it's a combination of land donation, straight up cash, and tax exemptions, then it would just be developers building what they want to develop. But here it's $10 million worth of public subsidy that they're asking for their own private project, and with no cap on the profit that they can make. And so we're saying, no, we don't want to be subsidizing the high profit model. And instead, we want to actually be addressing and preserving the public subsidy within the community for what are essential needs, essential infrastructure needs. And so we know that actually in the 30-day period, 5,000 people in the city of Eugene accessed homelessness services. Mm-hmm. And there's an estimated 9,000 unhoused people that are identified within the county within Lane County. So the numbers are extraordinary, right? And yet recently the city of Eugene did something that's unprecedented, which was to pass a payroll tax, which would go towards what's called the Community Safety Initiative. That tax is anticipated to generate $23 million a year. And of that $23 million, 80% is currently earmarked for what's called, what I would call criminalization. Other people would just say the police, jail beds, cops, prosecutors. And only 7% is earmarked for homelessness services. And so that actually was a complete inversion when they were putting together the potential of this payroll tax for community safety. The city hired consultants to find out what were the concerns within the community. By far, the largest category of concern was homelessness. So one single category of response, the single largest, was 40% of respondents said homelessness. Only 4% said safety, named safety as an issue. In fact, traffic congestion was a higher priority when polled, and yet you see the flip in the numbers. 80% is going towards, as I say, criminalization, policing. And so the third demand in this letter is that all these funds generated from this extra tax, which would go towards policing, get reallocated towards homelessness services and housing. When we were thinking that through, there is no doubt that in our minds that communal wellness has to do with meeting people's basic needs and not policing people. And in fact, there will be so much. I mean, unfortunately, the city has not taken it on to show what percentage of the police budget goes towards sweeping camps, issuing fines for open container, issuing fines for people, leaning against a building, et cetera. These things that just, there could be a major decrease in policing activity just by providing and reallocating that funding elsewhere. So I think in some language that is used for this by some groups is defunding the police. And sometimes the flip side of that doesn't get said, which is to reallocate the funds elsewhere. And all the organizations on this group, although I don't know, I think maybe some organizations would possibly feel uncomfortable with the jargon of defund the police, just because that, the mainstream media does a pretty good job of sort of saying, this is what defund the policers look like. And then, show graffiti or something like that, as if it's a very fringe notion or outsider notion to say, hey, we should be funding basic needs and basic wellness rather than, a punishment model. And so I think that it's exciting that so many organizations always have to kind of be diplomatic because they want to be, and need to be longstanding and consider, the politics within the community and all that. And even with those pressures, they have all signed on to a letter that demands reallocating all the funds allocated towards policing within that community safety initiative. So 80% of 23 million to homelessness and housing.
So when you're talking about the community safety initiative funds, you're not talking about the regular, already incredibly high police budget. This is an additional pool of millions of dollars that would go to putting unhoused people in prisons, correct?
Yes. So the overall Eugene police budget is about 68 million. And actually, it's been really exposed about the transparency of the Eugene city budget is really lacking. If you try to look at it, for example, there's a whole $35 million within the police budget. It's only broken down for the public into two categories: personnel and I think it's materials or something like that. But you can't actually see where that money is going at any deeper level. And so, for example, I think they just spent community safety initiative funds for a surveillance bus that costs, I think I saw $600,000, and it gets parked outside of a place where people are camping because they have nowhere else to go. And, for years, people have been asking for a basic hygiene bus, like a mobile showers bus. Mm-hmm. And always we've been told that's not affordable. So you imagine going to apply for a job when you haven't been able to take a shower, right? For 2-3 weeks, and also just generally how you feel. I mean, people want to be able to shower. But to your question, the Community Safety Initiative is just a portion. It's just what they've looked to expand to sort of superfund the police to actually bring the average number of police officers per capita higher than anywhere else in the nation, or higher than the average in the nation. So, again, as something that can be fits under the rubric of defund the police. I just would like to mitigate the fear that brings up for some people, because, many people who truly are abolitionists, who envision a society in which we don't have policing, we have true care and relational accountability rather than punitive accountability. Even abolitionist visionaries are generally not imagining that the police are going to disappear entirely overnight, and cities everywhere are just going to cut the budgets 100%. But, and I don't want to nix that for anyone who is advocating that, but to say, hey, you know what? You just expanded the police budget, despite that before the pandemic, we had a houselessness crisis that was growing threefold every year. This is not okay. And actually, it's amazing here in Eugene, they had listening sessions on that the city says they set up those listening sessions and a whole process to consider reallocating funds from the Community Safety Initiative after the protests of last summer. And in those listening sessions, about 100 people spoke. And of those 100 people, only 3 people did not speak critically of the Eugene Police Department. And those 3 people were someone who sits on the police commission, the president of the Chamber of Commerce, and then the former mayor's grandson, who has recently received close to a $5 million city subsidy for a major development that they just had downtown. And how I see that is, when you take public subsidies for your massively for-profit project, and you are a downtown landowner, property owner, with such disproportionate ownership over the land and the buildings, well, you want the police to protect the frictions and the suffering that is the result of that inequity, right? Inequity doesn't just stand at peace by itself, right? It actually needs policing in order for that inequity to stand, is how I see it. And so I kind of see that we saw that play out. And then unfortunately, the city staff summarized those listening sessions for the city council by saying that they said, we're going to summarize the themes. One theme was law enforcement. They failed to say that 97% of the feedback about law enforcement was critical. That's just an example. So our city council, who might intend to represent us, is given information which they didn't know that 90% of it was critical of the police.
Right. It's critical to look at who the police serve, who they protect, and versus who they target. In the book, The End of Policing by Alex S. Vitale, Chapter 5 expands on how the police serve the elite by routinely harming unhoused people. Quote, police routinely break up encampments, driving people into more remote and isolated conditions that leave them more vulnerable to robberies, assaults, and the elements. Even those with a place to stay at night are often turned out during the day, with little to do besides chase social services and look for work as best they can. Some efforts to remove homeless people through criminalization are clearly linked to economic development initiatives. Los Angeles' Save Cities Initiative, SCI, was a bald-faced attempt to drive homeless people out of the historic Skid Row area to make way for gentrification. Ironically, Skid Row itself was originally created as a kind of ghetto of social services for the very poor in order to keep them out of other residential neighborhoods. But as LA's downtown has become more developed and desirable, Skid Row has become a valuable area for real estate development. The main stated goal of SCI was to reduce crime in a target 50-block area through intensive broken windows-oriented enforcement. 50 additional police officers were assigned to the area, along with numerous specialized units. Homeless encampments were cleared away, thousands of arrests made, and many more citations issued. The disorder associated with mass homelessness has played a role in the rise of more conservative urban politics, as well-meaning liberals who call for social tolerance of disorder while long-term solutions are attempted but never realized, are replaced with neoconservatives who question the ability of government to solve economic problems and instead rely on aggressive policing to push homeless people out of public view. At the center of this dynamic is the deeply conservative broken windows theory. In general, broken windows policing merely creates a revolving door in which homeless people are arrested, sent through the jail and court system, and then released back into the community in the same condition they left it. This process rarely results in someone's stabilization. These agencies almost never have access to permanent housing or even long-term mental health or substance abuse services. We live in an economic and social environment in which the market is unable to house people at the bottom of the economic order, and government is unwilling to make up the difference. Given this reality, how can we justify treating homelessness as a criminal justice issue? The law appears to be applied universally, but this fails to take into account the fact that the poor are always under greater pressure to break it and at greater risk of being subjected to legal action. As Anatole France pointed out in 1894, quote, "In its majestic equality, the law forbids rich and poor alike to sleep under bridges, beg in the streets, and steal loaves of bread," end quote. There is an issue of substantive justice here. Even if the law is enforced equitably and without bias or malice, it still results in the incarceration of large numbers of people who are homeless, mentally ill, and poor, rather than hardened predators. Ultimately, the criminalization of homeless people should be understood as a way of managing growing inequality through increasingly punitive mechanisms of state control. The aggressive policing of homeless people may appear to be about improving the quality of life of middle-class residents, but to the extent that it does so only by worsening the conditions of homeless people. In the process, it also relieves elected officials of the responsibility to embrace a transformative urban politics that focuses on the needs of poor people in terms of structural changes to housing and employment markets, as well as essential social services like healthcare." End quote. This does not even begin to cover other marginalized identities within the unhoused population that the police are even more violent towards, such as trans people of color. But it does provide an overview of how policing, which is inherently violent, does nothing to protect or help some of the most vulnerable community members. Do you know the demographics of those who are unhoused in Eugene?
I wish I knew this better, and I really don't. And I do not know if the city or the county has good tracking of that, but I can say, as I co-own a home, and that I say is on Kalapuyan land, and so I'm participating in an occupation of stolen land. But we have had, I think it's 21 unhoused people sleep on this property for in the last 3 years, and 70% of those people have been Black.
According to a 2020 study by endhomelessness.org, quote, "Pacific Islanders and Native Americans are most likely to be homeless in America when compared to all other racial/ethnic groups. Within the former, 160 people experience homelessness out of every 10,000, compared to the national average of 17 out of every 10,000. Pacific Islanders and Native Americans are numerically small groups within the U.S., making it more difficult for the U.S. Census Bureau and homelessness service systems to count them accurately. Nevertheless, available data suggests they face significant challenges. Black Americans, multiracial Americans, and Hispanics/Latinx are similarly situated. Group members are far more likely to be homeless than the national average and white Americans," end quote. In a 2019 study by this same organization, Oregon ranked the 6th highest nationally in terms of rate of homelessness per 10,000 people. Do you know what the statistics are like for disabled unhoused people in Eugene?
So I can say I don't know how. I would think the numbers are higher than this, but of those people sleeping on our property, 3 have been wheelchair dependent, 1 has been blind. And to me, it's not at all anomalous to see unhoused people who are using wheelchairs, regularly. In fact, so one of the women who lived with us and is now on the street, she is 76 years old, blind, dependent on a wheelchair, and she recently was provided a motel room through St. Vincent de Paul. And I had worked with the county on her, accessing displacement. And we had actually ruled out this motel for her because it's not ADA accessible. And so she had ended up going to the hospital, and when they discharged her into basically the St. Vinny's case management, and then they ended up routing her into this very motel that I had already known, and she had known, but may not have known it was this particular hotel, was not ADA accessible. In any case, she ended up being there for 2 nights, and I saw her again about 4 days after she left there. And she was so in a different state of mind because of how exhausting and how much of a harassment she felt it was to be, there's a lot you have to do, paperwork, telling your name, telling your story, getting, showing up at a place to interview with this person, et cetera, et cetera. And then to be placed in a motel room without an accessible bathroom. She just said, her line to me was, I am no longer interested in being a pawn for the systems and the people that pretend to care when they don't. And so to her, I mean, it's interesting. City council members here in Eugene recently, sort of one of them broke down unhoused people into categories of cans, can'ts, and won'ts, and said, I want to help the cans, I want to help the can'ts, and I want punitive measures for the won'ts. And so this 76-year-old woman who is blind and wheelchair dependent would fall into the category now of won'ts, because she is so tired of being shuffled around and played with and given such, to not have an accessible bathroom is, it's just too much. And so, when I think of categorizing people that way, and then to basically consider how she has become someone who's saying, you know what, I don't even want you to use me, as if you're taking care and meeting my needs because you're not coming close.
So when you speak of punitive measures, you're referring to the police, to carceral systems, correct?
Incarceration, ticketing incarceration, mandating court dates, which are very hard to get to. In fact, I know that she has missed one, quite understandably, and then at some point that will convert to a warrant for her arrest, which of course leaves her vulnerable, to all sorts of things.
So it sounds like then that there's a lot of gatekeeping involved in accessing the limited resources that often don't work for people, that then circles back around into punishment rather than help, because it's not based on what individuals actually need.
Yeah, exactly. I think that here's just another example of a man that is living on the property we're on. He had just about 2 months ago had to report to the Springfield jail for a 2019 criminal trespass. Again, that's leaning up against a building, being on the portion of sidewalk that's privately owned. First of all, what sense does it make to make someone go to jail? I think he had 7 days he had to spend in jail during a pandemic. What sense does that make? And so payroll tax, part of it was to increase jail beds. So this is so that someone who 2 years ago, was sitting on the portion of sidewalk they're not allowed to sit on, can serve 7 days in jail for what? And then he is an incredible human being. As when I say incredible human being, I'm not looking to differentiate or make hierarchies of human beings, but when you see people who suffer so much, and this includes the 76-year-old woman I was just talking about, I was in awe of the resiliency of her spirit and of this man's spirit, the graciousness. And it was only in my last interaction with the 76-year-old woman, after she had not shown any bitterness, and this she did. She was done with humanity at this point. That may evolve some in her again. But anyway, he had prepared himself to go to jail. He really didn't want to. His son had come from out of state, concerned about, this impending jail time. And he finally got himself, he meditates a lot, got himself ready, and went to, so I should know the date. It was maybe it was February 2nd or something. He had to report, whatever the date was, the day before Lane Transit District began reinforcing fare collection. So they had suspended it throughout the pandemic. So he had to get off of the bus and so wasn't able to make it there in time. He then communicated with us, and my partner was going to drive him to the jail. He called the jail and said, you know what, I just had to get off the bus because I didn't know you were collecting fares again, and I can be there within the hour. And they said, and this was about 20 minutes after the time he was supposed to report, which I think was 9 a.m. And they said, nope, it's already been converted to a warrant. You're going to have to wait and, hear from the judge or be arrested. I mean, it's just all so silly, right? I mean, that speaks to me so much, is like, oh, right. The misfortune of, the day before them reinforcing fare collection, him not knowing about it. And then suddenly he's got a warrant for his arrest, which, in this case, it didn't escalate into a bunch of other things, but it surely could have. And it, could have escalated into longer jail time. So it's just, I don't know, the systems that we have do not make sense. I think that, I'm a parent. It's funny, I spend as an organizer, a lot of my time and energy on things such as houselessness and trying to develop systems that make far more sense than policing and punitive systems. So when we look at all the vectors of the state of the world, I mean, things are not healthy. I want to encourage all organizations to be as bold as they can be, because so often what happens is that organizations become the soft face or the positive face for actually, things that perpetuate further destruction. So I see that organizations have come on when we talk different economic modeling, insisting on a different economic model, that is organizations being bold and standing up for something, because we know where there's money at stake, then there's lobbyists and there's, so I feel pretty great about the organizations here that have stepped up. And I really encourage other cities and organizations to, this is just one example. The more that we all do it, the more we can say, hey, look over there. They demanded this. This is not so out there. It's pretty basic.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. I absolutely agree. I want to kind of, because we've covered so much, and we're going to kind of go back a little bit. When, as a whole, right, this is a fight for a lot of structural changes, and fighting a lot of structural injustice and systemic harm. When you talk about affordable housing, does that also mean accessible housing? I think oftentimes I've seen the terms used interchangeably, but when we're talking about a disability justice lens, they're not necessarily, they should be the same, but they are not necessarily the same.
Yes, absolutely. And so this is why we want, when we talk community controlled housing, whether community owned or community controlled housing. So, if you have a community land trust, then the land will be leased and you might have a limited equity cooperative controlling it, or however it's managed. When there are covenants that's, for example, pro-disabled covenants, then those voices are right at the table, right? And making sure that, for example, what happened to my friend where she's given a motel room, but it's not accessible. What is that? That's not okay. That's not help. So, we feel, pretty committed to the affordable not being enough. So that's why we have written into this letter that it has been signed on all these pro covenants, right? So actually, I think it means something. For example, this is a very central downtown building. And some people have suggested to us that, our ideas sound nice, but maybe not for this downtown center, because the downtown is, where, frankly, there's concentration. They say, it's more expensive, and it's a concentration of wealth center. And we feel really strongly that actually the culture as a whole is hurt if disabled people are marginalized, less visible, because the accessible housing is out Highway 99 or I don't know. I keep not wanting to use this word invisibilize because it's just too many syllables, but it just keeps coming up into my head. Like, that's just invisibilizing people. They're doing it with houseless people all the time. And I don't know. I mean, it shakes me to the core when I have seen people using wheelchairs rolling through mud to get to the edge of the riverbank where it slopes down, and they're less likely to be seen by police or reported for being houseless. I mean, it gives me, I'm not the one suffering really, but I'm saying it gives me tremors. Like, this is not a society that is well, right? Yeah. So, but to answer your question, I think we list the two words affordable and accessible housing and see those as distinct but jointly necessary.
Right, yeah, because when we talk about, making certain communities marginalized, it's a very intentional, sometimes on an individual level and always on a systemic level of, pushing people out of the way. And that's represented, I think the most visceral representation of that is in people who are unhoused, right? Because when we talk about, the unhoused population and sweeps and whatnot, it's not because, unhoused people are causing, any harm or any destruction of property, which even if they were, property is not more valuable than human life, although capitalism says otherwise. And, it's all about getting them out of the way, out of, in a making sure that they are not visible to quote unquote society, I guess. And, when, so many disabled people are part of the unhoused population, so many people of color, it all ties in together to this marginalization of disabled people, of people of color. And so I think that really showcasing and forcing a kind of community-based model in a sense of saying like, no, we're here and we're not going to go anywhere and we're not going to be hidden is incredibly powerful. And especially pushing out, and it sounds like, a community-based housing also pushes landlords out of the way. And, landlords it's just for profit. It's kind of a horrifying thing. I never really looked into it as a concept until last summer. And then I was like, why do landlords even exist? They buy something and then they just make money and make money and make money by doing absolutely nothing. And we think that that's okay because it's like, well, they figured out the game. So capitalism says, here's your money. And it's like, yeah, but it's quite frankly immoral. Somewhat switching topics now, I was wondering, does the Decriminalize Homelessness Alliance work alongside the local indigenous tribes? Did you work with the Kalapuya people on the Willamette Street proposal?
It's interesting. So the Kalapuyan people basically were actually not federally recognized for a long time. And then some are part of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde and some the Siletz Indians. But the Kalapuyan people were, relocated and sort of assimilated into, along with other indigenous tribes and groups. We have reached out to the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde. However, we're also aware that that sort of high-end governmental structure is not always representative. And I'm not saying anything particular with any particular knowledge about the leadership of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde. But that's sort of like, it's the governmental level. And that's different than the level of the people. And so most of the indigenous people I know living in Eugene are not Kalapuyan. They've been displaced from elsewhere. And because we have personal relationships, we know them, it feels like an alliance that where it's we can assess the solidarity more clearly than if we, I really don't know people at the governance levels of the Confederated Tribes. And I would like. I mean, I feel like now with so many organizations signed on, including Indigenous community members here, like prominent Indigenous community members here, that there's a greater likelihood that we might get a response. And also, if we don't, I could expect that it might be a matter of intergovernmental diplomacy. So does that make sense? That
Absolutely.
I just don't want to delegitimize who we are representing, such as prominent Indigenous community members here, just because we don't sort of have the official, federally recognized governance.
Yeah, no, definitely. It sounds like it's more of an authentic community relationship than something that's necessarily trying to check a box, which ultimately, I think that that is also an important thing to have. Besides the proposal, what are some other crucial issues in your community right now?
Yeah. So one thing I will just say quickly, there's a big riverfront development right on the bank of the Willamette in downtown Eugene, where it's a total of 16 acres. And the city is basically poised to sell to out-of-town developers with, $2 billion worth of real estate development internationally to develop luxury housing. And, that's, to me, depressing. It's not what we need. Then another portion of the development project there is to give away 3 acres of land and the defunct steam plant, which is a very prominent building. And the people who they're giving the steam plant to are the same, much of the same development team as the ones looking, having a predatory relationship with public resource at 1059 Willamette. And actually, their vision is for something of the steam plant to be something of a cultural center. And by that, they mean to have a tap house on the ground level floor to allow public access to the atrium, and then to have private offices on the upper levels. And one of the developers, I'm quoting phrases that he used, is that this would be a place where tech transplants from the Bay Area can build community. So this is a limited liability corporation of white cis men, and that have gross disproportionate access to capital, who have made a proposal to the city. And they've even said, it can be something of a leadership hub, et cetera. And then they name building community for tech transplants from the Bay Area. And I recently was going to a missing and murdered Indigenous and girls event on the riverbank, and biked by the steam plant on the way to the event, and then biked by it again on the way back with this in my mind. And the event had red dresses and trees to represent missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And the Indigenous people at this event, a refrain was, one day a year, we will mention the murder. And I sort of took from that, like, there's either too much grief to represent it on other days, or it's not even safe to sort of represent it on other days. I'm not sure. But to be passing by this building that then is going to supposedly be a cultural hub, where who controls that vision is white cis men, with interest in building community for techies, it's kind of heartbreaking to me, but also it's so not the stewardship that the world needs.
I will say, though, I think it's important to use very specific language when we talk about how capitalists and how people with an enormous amount of money are taking over land that is stolen land, that is occupied land, that is indigenous land. It is a reestablishment of settler colonialism. It is a reestablishment of violence and of occupation, and a continuation of what, America was founded on. And so I think I'm really glad you shared that, because I think sometimes when we talk about things like capitalism and colonialism and colonization, it becomes very vague, big ideas, but on a very specific, very real level, every moment that we don't fight against the continued occupation of land is just continuing to allow that to happen. Learningforjustice.org explains how, quote, "We can begin by defining settler colonialism as it relates specifically to indigenous peoples of North America. The goal of settler colonization is the removal and erasure of indigenous peoples in order to take the land by settlers in perpetuity. According to Laura Hurwitz and Sean Bork's Settler Colonialism Primer, quote, "This means that settler colonialism is not just a vicious thing of the past, such as the gold rush, but exists as long as settlers are living on appropriated land and thus exists today." End quote. Historically, the settler colonial agenda involved committing genocide by murdering indigenous peoples. See Manifest Destiny, the Wounded Knee Massacre of 1890, and the Wounded Knee Siege of 1970, the Sand Creek Massacre, King Philip's War, and countless other conflicts. That agenda also meant stealing land through treaties that were later broken or ignored. See the 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie and the history of the Lakota and the unceded Black Hills. Understand that the United States couldn't exist today without its settler colonial foundation. Today, settler colonialism plays out in the erasure of indigenous presence. American schools do not teach about Native Americans, past or present. When they do, information is often wrong or incomplete. Students are rarely taught about contemporary Native peoples who have survived the settler colonial process and continue to thrive, create, practice their traditions, and live modern lives. Mainstream media outlets rarely feature stories about indigenous people, and exceptions are usually during a crisis. See #NoDAPL. The government diminishes and destroys indigenous nations by denying their sovereignty or stealing land for private corporations to use for drilling, mining, fracking, farming, and more. End quote. In regards to the continuing violence committed against indigenous people, variations of the acronym MMIWG2S is often used. This stands for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, Girls, and Two-Spirit People. According to a study by the Urban Indian Health Institute, quote, "The National Crime Information Center reports that in 2016, there were 5,712 reports of missing American Indian and Alaska Native women and girls, though the U.S. Department of Justice's Federal Missing Persons Database, NamUs, only logged 116 cases. The Center for Disease Control and Prevention has reported that murder is the third leading cause of death among American Indian and Alaska Native women, and that rates of violence on reservations can be up to 10 times higher than the national average. However, no research has been done on rates of such violence among American Indian and Alaska Native women living in urban areas, despite the fact that approximately 71% of American Indian and Alaska Natives live in urban areas. Despite this ongoing crisis, there is a lack of data and an inaccurate understanding of MMIWG, creating a false perception that the issue does not affect off-reservation/village American Indian and Alaska Native communities. However, according to an analysis of 2016 census data, 50.2% of the urban Indian population identified as female. The data in this report also includes LGBTQ, non-binary, and two-spirit individuals. The majority of American Indian and Alaska Native people now live in urban communities due to a variety of reasons for migration, from forced relocation due to 1950s federal relocation and termination policies to current barriers to obtaining quality educational, employment, and housing opportunities on tribal lands. Because of this, urban American Indian and Alaska Native people experience MMIWG-related violence in two ways: through losses experienced by extended family and community ties on reservations, in villages, and in urban communities themselves. Though there are critical issues regarding jurisdiction of MMIWG cases on reservation and village lands, lack of prosecution, lack of proper data collection, prejudice, and institutional racism are factors that also occur in urban areas." End quote. The link to this study will be in the description below. But to go back to my question, what can other people do to support the work that you and others are doing in Eugene?
So one, please feel free to write our city council or to call city council, or perhaps more importantly, you're welcome to, I'll just say my email address and my phone number. And honestly, I'm happy to connect with anyone that wants to organize anytime, and then I can get you connected with other organizers here. I just am not free to give out other contact information. My email is zondie.free, ZONDIE free, FREE @gmail.com. My phone number, which is great for texting, is 650-743-8588. I can put you on email you or whatever works best, literature on or letters that we're sending, but also to know that if, for example, if you want a copy of the letter, to adapt it to something you're working on in your community, that is great. I think cross-pollinating is super. So, some organizing I've done, it's been amazing when I'm like, oh, and I find a model in another city, right? What people are demanding elsewhere. And you're like, oh, wow, this is all like so well thought out. And this, like, I'm so enlightened, this is off the mark of the organizing we're doing, but I really encourage people to watch a video which is on YouTube called Killing the Klamath, because Klamath Lake, there's actually some organizing by the Klamath tribes to call for preserving Klamath Lake, and they have a plan for how to do it. But basically, the Klamath Lake has a species of fish that is found nowhere else in the world, only in Klamath Lake. And that fish is expected to be extinct in 10 years because of irrigation, cattle farming, and pesticides. And it is toxic for humans or dogs, pets, to go in that lake at this point, despite that the Klamath tribes survived on that lake for 16,500 years. So, I mean, this is, again, just underscoring, our push to have that steam plant building and that riverfront property not be given away, but actually be part of land back. Because we need other stewardship than the, what I call a white supremacy model, which is capitalism. And I mean, one other thing to note, this land on the riverfront in Eugene, which I'm talking about, overlooks the other side of the riverbank, what was Eugene's first place where Black people owned property. There was a neighborhood called Ferry Street Village. And in 1949, that village was given an ordinance declared that all residents of that village had 10 days to leave, and that anyone who remained on the 10th day could be evicted by all means necessary. And so this land is about to be given away. That land where Ferry Street Village is now a public park and green space. And then this land is about to be given away again to a corporation, where Black people, if it weren't for Black exclusion laws and then the raising of their neighborhood, would have a stronghold in the center of Eugene, and that would, bring some economic prosperity. And we don't rectify that at all as we give away land to a white cis male controlled high capitalism operation. We give it away. So we think, I think people like, in mainstream society, if you talk about giving land back, say, to Kalapuyan people in Eugene, that's sort of like a, whoa, and yet we give land away. We do it, right? We give it to, white cis men, capitalists, limited liability corporations with gross access to capital that has been built on the backs of others and public resource extraction.
Is there anything, any final words or anything else you want to share before we kind of sign off?
Oh, no, just that, I gave my personal information, and I forgot to say, I also would just love to hear anything, concerns in other communities or organizing going on in other communities. And if we can show solidarity, then we would love to do that.
If you're interested in learning more about housing, this episode's recommended book is Take Back the Land by Max Rameau. The link to purchase this book can be found in the episode description, or check it out and support your local library. To learn more about decolonization and the history of settler colonialism, check out the Red Nation movement at therednation.org, or learn more about the ongoing genocide of Indigenous people at mmIwhoismissing.org. Thanks again to Zondi Zinke for speaking with me. This has been Voices in Action, a podcast brought to you by EOSIL. Stay informed, stay safe, and remember, we are occupying stolen land.